Well, welcome to Martin Library. I want to thank everybody for coming out on this weirdly wet and warm February day. I know it's a challenge to get around today, so we really appreciate you taking the time to come talk to us. We are here today for a discussion with the York Daily Record Editorial Board. We like to hold open sessions, meetings in public with members of the public on important issues. And we really appreciate you taking the time to come and visit with us today. And I'd like to mention that we're live streaming this session today at YDR.com. That video will also be archived there. It will be on our YouTube site. So anybody who is interested in watching this session can do so later. You can share it with friends or people who might be interested in this topic. So thank you so much. So today we're here to talk about escaping domestic violence in York County. And let me just give you a little bit of background of why we're having a discussion today. On February 7th, the York Daily Record published a special report on the granting of temporary protection from abuse orders in the York County Court of Common Pleas. The piece reported that from 2010 to 2014, our court's denial of temporary PFAs was well above the state denial rate. And so as a follow-up to that report, we thought it would be fruitful to have a public editorial board session to talk about PFAs, domestic violence generally in York County, and what we can do as a community and through systemic changes and improvements to reduce the incidence of domestic violence and protect victims. So we thank the folks at Martin Library for providing the space for today's event, and we'll go ahead and get started. So one other thing I wanted to mention. This is an informal discussion, so we have folks here who are interested in this topic. If you have something to add to the conversation, especially if it's maybe a quick follow-up question to something one of our panelists says, raise your hand. We'll try to get to you. I'm also planning to leave some time at the end of our session for the last 10-15 minutes to allow folks in the audience to speak up or to ask questions. Probably mainly ask questions. That's what we're looking for. So you'll have that opportunity at the end. So. Let me introduce our panelists today. So first, to my left here, we have Rick Zaro, who is with the York YWCA. He's Chief Services Officer, correct?
Correct.
We have Ellen Kramer, who is an attorney with... No, we don't have Ellen. I apologize. Ellen couldn't make it. She's with the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Domestic Violence and the Weather Deterrent for today, so I apologize for that. Heather Keller, who is a legal advocacy director with the YWCA's York's Access York and Victim Assistance Center. Thank you for coming. Also, we have Ann Acker, who is director of the YWCA of Hanover Safe Home organization. So thank you for coming. I'd also quickly like to acknowledge some other folks in the room. The two reporters who worked on this report that I mentioned, Randy Kessler and Ed Mann are both in the room. They're here to report on the session today. Remember, it's on the record, so what you say will or might be recorded. Also would like to acknowledge, I think I see President Judge Joe Adams here, so thank you for coming. I think Judge Mike Lamley is here with us today as well, so thank you for coming. And also Gene Truthart, who is director of the YDR. Thank you for joining us today. Okay, so here are broad outlines for discussion today. We'd like to know, do we think that the community is equipped or well-funded enough to absorb victims seeking protection? Do victims understand the avenues available to them? Do victims of different cultural backgrounds and languages understand those things as well? And we know that there are some gaps in the temporary PFA system, and so what are those gaps and what can we do to plug them? Okay, so I'm going to sit down here and starting with the questions. So and obviously this is not directed to anyone in particular. Whoever feels like they can answer it best, so jump in. How do Pennsylvania's Protection from Abuse Act laws compare to other states? And do you think there are any improvements to the laws that would be helpful?
Oh, they're looking at me. Well, first of all, before I answer, thank you all for being here. I can only assume that you're here because this issue means something to you, and we know that domestic violence is a very real situation in our community. 15 domestic violence related fatalities in this year alone, an all-time high. So we want to continue our efforts and our advocacy to look at systems, look at our own practice, and aspire to be the best that we can. So I appreciate you appreciate very much that you're here today. In terms of your question about other states, actually in Pennsylvania, the laws are pretty good, comparatively speaking. The challenge a lot of times I think nationally we face with PFAs is A, are they enforced? Does it incite a potential abuser to greater violence? Because we do know that 75% of domestic violence related fatalities happen when the victim is attempting to leave a violent situation. So the PFA is a useful tool, but it's also at a very dangerous point in people's cycle of abuse. So the challenge, I think, for many anywhere is this the best or the most appropriate step toward their independence free of violence? And that's always the question victims face before they go before a judge. So that's a challenge. But nationwide, we have a pretty good PFA system in terms of penalties for violations of PFAs. Again, the challenge is always enforcing those violations and helping victims to understand it is not their only option for response to a domestic violence situation.
Does anybody else have anything to add up to that? So you wouldn't say, okay, looking at Pennsylvania compared to some other state in particular, you wouldn't be able to offer any specific suggestions that would be improvement of our laws, essentially?
Well, I think like any other legislation that results in process, the challenge always is to make sure the process has integrity and is examined and scrutinized. And I'm deeply appreciative that Judge Adams is here today, because I'm certain he wants what we all want, which is the best process that makes the most sense, that balances everybody's interests. So I think the challenge always isn't in the law, it's how the law is then implemented and where there are discrepancies and holes. I'll give you a great example. The PFA in Pennsylvania allows for the removal of firearms. Not everywhere is that the case, but I also know that that's sometimes, the complexities of that is sometimes a deterrent for people to access a PFA because they are concerned that that will escalate their abuser if their firearms are removed. So each one of those situations are really unique in their many dynamics that factor into how we respond. Is this the best option? Is it not?
You mentioned the process. Do you think that the process we're asking for and getting a PFA in Pennsylvania should be more consistent? Is it consistent across the state? If not, why not? And what should be done about it?
Well, I think it's difficult. It's a difficult question to answer, and I can't speak to how the process works in other counties. But what I can tell you is that reaching a decision to go before the judge and ask for protection is not an easy decision for anyone. I've never met anyone where it's easy. Like, oh yeah, I know exactly what I want to do and this is how I'm going to do it, and don't have any feelings about that, because that's not the nature of domestic violence. We are not talking about someone who is assaulted by a stranger on the street. Oftentimes with that, we see anger. We see, absolutely, I want this person held accountable, I want them found, I want this taken care of. When you add love to the mix, when you add children to the mix, when you add someone who is able to see the complexities of someone else's personality, this is not just one interaction with them, but sometimes months, sometimes years of interaction with that person. It is never, ever an easy decision to say, I need to ask the court for protection. It's not an easy process. I think that your articles have certainly highlighted that it's not just, oh, I'm going to get protection and it's done and that it's easy. It is absolutely a process. Do I think that things should be streamlined? I think was your question. Should things be more consistent? I I think that it is very important that judges are able to look at each case and not be saddled with, it must be this way or it must be that way. We tend to think of the law as all or nothing. It's black or white, it's clear cut. When we're dealing with human beings, it is mostly gray. And so when you're trying to make those two worlds meet, it's very challenging. And the judge's ability to use their discretion with that, I think, is very important and valuable. So I would not like to see things so, streamlined across the state, this is the way it is, and then you take away the judge's ability to really look at the situation and make a decision. But I think that it's important to look at those decisions within the context of lethality, within the context of the very, very difficult decision that someone is making in order to reach out to the court, because that is a very humbling, very scary, and sometimes very dangerous thing to do. And so each victim needs to be able to look at the situation and judge by their own experiences what is going to be in their best interest, and each judge needs to be able to look at the whole picture and not say, well, because I granted one for this case, I have to grant one for this case. It does need to be, there needs to be discretion in there.
Right. So that's one of the things I wondered about after reading Brandy and Ed's piece is the law too specific, or is it not specific enough?
Well, if I can also talk in place of Ellen Kramer, who unfortunately couldn't be here, I know that PCADV, the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Domestic Violence, has best practice standards that they will disseminate to various counties, all of the counties, in terms of the PFA process, including the judges. We have a bench book that informs judges. One of the things that I think is, and this may be my particular bias, is I don't believe we can be a society, particularly around this issue, that is not trauma informed. So I'm a strong advocate that law enforcement, court systems really understand the nature of trauma, because I find in my 25 years of practice that a lot of times victims are misunderstood or wounded again because there isn't an understanding of that trauma. So one of the things I've advocated to PCADV is to throw out there basic Trauma 101 training on the impact of victims, so that there is a greater sensitivity. And when I say sensitivity, I don't mean bias. I'm not trying to bias the court in a direction or law enforcement, but law enforcement folks for years have said to me, we want to understand this. We don't want to hurt victims in an interrogation process, but we also know that by understanding the trauma, we're more likely to arrive at a more realistic and better situation, decision, whatever it may be. So for me, I'd love to see statewide an initiative toward trauma-informed training for folks to really have a sensitivity to that. One of the reasons that we even have legal advocates is once upon a time, there was such a high risk of people going into the court system and being re-traumatized or wounded again by well-intentioned people, but because they didn't understand trauma and they didn't understand victimology. So the whole origin of having an advocate in court was to be there to guide a victim through that, to diminish the potential for that form of secondary wounding where people are injured again or a victim is blamed. So to me, that speaks to the need to really take an initiative that looks at, let's understand victims. Let's understand what they're going through, and I think all of our various roles, we will better be suited to, perform with that understanding.
So this training that you mentioned, this would be for law enforcement people, judicial people on the bench?
Absolutely. All systems involved that interact with victims, we can be more victim sensitive. I've even done trainings with the colleges where an RA needs to understand Trauma 101. They need to be victim sensitive when that kid comes to them and reports something. I mean, it's all of the systems that interact where victims find themselves because there is a heightened risk that they will continuously be traumatized in their interactions with systems. So my hope would be, if you trace a victim through the many systems they have to negotiate, all of those folks have a sophisticated understanding of trauma.
And just to add to that, I think it's really critical when you talk about trauma-informed and domestic violence, because domestic violence victims exhibit what we call counterintuitive behaviors that may confuse a judge or may confuse even an advocate or the police by making it seem that they're not afraid. So when we do understand trauma and how it manifests itself, it's just really, really critical, and you can provide better services.
Rick, are you aware of any counties or any place outside of Pennsylvania that's had that type of trauma training in the court system that you would point to as an example of success?
I'm not aware. I think it probably does exist, but I will say there really is a lot of initiative to elevate our practice through an understanding of trauma. I can say in law enforcement, I've had the privilege to train all over the country trauma trainings, and a lot of times the law enforcement community has requested it, because once upon a time we don't want to poo-poo anybody, we have an investigation to do, and now they're realizing by being sensitive, not only are victims handled better, but our investigations benefit from it. So I know there is a huge momentum in law enforcement in this training. I know it is now a part of Maryland's law enforcement police academy training, the trauma piece. It is, so I think we will see this evolve in a lot of different places. Again, it just informs us in our practice and our roles.
Just a quick question on that point. When you talk about training, are you more along the lines of voluntary training? In other words, a municipality or a police department voluntarily says they want a part of that, or mandatory?
Well, in terms of that, I guess, that's always an infamous question. Do we mandate something and expect people to do it? And then the counter question is, by mandating it, is it really even beneficial? So for me, I would think there need to be a willingness and an interest. I'll give you a great example. I did a training at the New Jersey Sex Crimes Detectives State Conference. Everybody that came to that training electively came to that training to learn this and would apply it. I felt like that was a good model. I think if that would have been mandated, I would have had a third of the room that didn't want to be there and would have not wanted to listen. I just think that's human behavior. I'm not at a place where I think we need to mandate that particular training, but again, I think if you talk to law enforcement and judges, they get this. They understand the need for this. So, yes, ma'am.
You mentioned that the woman victim has an intricate knowledge of her victimizer. And in many situations, that knowledge includes the fact that he was traumatized himself and that he is perpetuating skills or non-skills that he received as a child, not to excuse an abuser in any way, but in using the trauma knowledge, do you use the trauma knowledge as to why the abuser might be abusing also, and what the American Psychiatric Association publishes a monthly or bi-monthly newsletter, which I get, and they're talking about one of the biggest indicators of whether there's going to be violence is alcohol. And Judge Casamatis years ago, after being the first PFA judge, did a study of what happened to those PFA cases. Did they reconcile? Did they get a divorce? Was there a violation of the order? And the last question he asked, just for the hell of it, was what phase of the moon was. And it was almost always within a couple of days of the full moon.
Right. Well, if I can answer your question, first of all, that understanding is imperative. We understand the cyclical nature of violence, and I maintain that if you want to look at any social problem, you can almost trace it back to some form of family violence that that is taken in other avenues. So yes, we like to understand the abuser's past history of abuse. You know, it's estimated that 80% of incarcerated individuals have early victimization in their families.
It changes the brain structure.
Right, so for us, yes, it's important in our understanding, particularly when you work with a victim. But I will tell you, our approach with a victim is they are the subjective expert on their lives. I will never take that away from them. We don't tell people what to do. We operate from an empowerment model where victims are self-guided. Our expertise comes in from a field knowledge and a field expertise, but it is only useful as the subjective expert wants to use that. So yes, I think it's important. We're not shocked when a victim comes in to our shelter, is beaten beyond recognition, can barely walk, and looks at us and says she loves her abuser and she wants to go back to him. That doesn't shock us because that's our area of expertise. And we respect her self-determination. Many people want to scream and yell, what do you mean you want to go back to her? Look what he did to you and blah, blah, blah. But the truth of the matter is this needs to be self-determined. People need to be able to do this. And it kind of goes back to your question about trauma training is you have to have a willingness and a place that you are moving in that direction already, whether it's through training or services.
You mentioned that you try not to judge victims and so forth, and you understand where they're coming from and why they might go back. What is your role in trying to keep them from going back? Is that part of your role? So you don't really advocate, say, don't go back into this situation?
What we do, I'm sorry, Am.
Go ahead.
Is really help them to look at their situation, and sometimes the best thing that we can do is help a victim safety plan for when she returns to an abusive situation. Because when you look at the dynamics of power and control, and you look at what's been present in the relationship, the victim has been told what to do for a very long time in many, many aspects of her life. From maybe what she puts on to wear for the day to what she's going to be able to spend at the grocery store to whatever. I mean, so many things are dictated. And so I certainly don't want myself, my advocates, my colleagues to be one more person telling someone else what to do. It is not me who at the end of the day is going home to an unsafe situation. It is her. And so what can we do? You know, if that person is not ready to leave, then they're not ready to leave. And it is not for me to say you must do this. You must. That's not my place. What my place is, okay, you're going home. Let's look at what that's going to look like. And tell me about, well, how's your neighborhood set up? How's your house set up? Let's look at what are things that we can put into place in order for you to return to this situation so that we do have some safeguards. And that is the best thing that I can do, one of my advocates can do, any one of us can do, is give you the information, support you through what it is that you're going to do. And we can look at what your options are, and I tell people this all the time, every day. Today you don't want to leave, and that's okay. And you don't have to leave, and no one's going to make you leave. And you might feel differently this afternoon. And if you feel differently this afternoon, call us back, and we'll talk about it. And you might not call us back this afternoon, but if you need us next week, or next month, or 2 years from now.
And they do.
And they do. And my analogy is always about planting seeds. We can't force that seed to grow. We can give it everything that it needs to take root when it takes root. But we don't make dictates.
But I think this is a good time to bring up the lethality assessment program that has been floated out by PCADV in 2013 in Pennsylvania. And it involves the police, when they respond to a domestic violence incident, they administer an 11 question screen, and if the victim screens in as what we call high risk, and it's a certain way they answer the questions, then they are connected immediately from the scene of the incident with victim services and the hotline. And so at that point, when the victim sees that the police are saying, look, you're in danger, I'm going to be connecting you with victim services. And then they come in the next day, hopefully, because that's the ultimate goal. And we say, look, this question, answering yes to that shows us that could be in some danger. And so, although we do still operate under the empowerment model, we are giving them more information to say, look, you could be in danger. And if you want to leave, if you want to do a PFA, if whatever you want to do, and we give them their options, and based on what their situation is, and how, give them their options and then let them choose what to do. But with that, they've gotten that much more information about the lethality of their situation.
Can you, the lethality assessment, are all local police departments using that at this point, or it's, I know there are some?
It's about 8 or 9 out of, 26 departments?
Do you think that's something that really needs to be done across the board? Is there a state role to essentially mandate that process, or?
Yeah, where that stands now is originally when we did the lethality assessment, when the Maryland, this model comes actually out of Maryland, and it's research based out of Johns Hopkins. They chose the model to make the training and participation elective by each police department. It wasn't mandated. The question on the table now is, should this be mandated? Is it serious enough, or do we continue to follow the direction of law enforcement? And I can honestly tell you, I don't have an answer for that. The position we have taken in York and PCADB has taken is, we're not going to make any police departments do this. We want them to be interested to sign up because we know it's going to be actualized more accurately if it's done that way. But I think there is a reasonable question to say, wait, we're talking about lethality here. Is this something that we should mandate? So I think at this current time, that conversation is still going on. There are certain advocates, again, well-intended advocates and legislators that say, this thing should be mandated, it can save lives. And then there are other people that say, let law enforcement lead the way with this, because what we have seen is more and more law enforcement, it's not like there's been a stalemate. We have people signing up and interested all the time. I'm not sure what Maryland's logic was behind organically allowing this to unfold, but I think they believe that that was the best way, and that was their best practice recommendation to anybody that would do this, and that's what PCADV followed. But again, that conversation continues, and I'm not sure, I don't have a strong opinion on either side at this point. Once upon a time I did, but the more I think about it, Maryland also has a different law enforcement system where it's county-based, so they have a lot less law enforcement. We have, tons of smaller law enforcement throughout the state of Pennsylvania, so our rollout may take longer, and that may be contraindicated to that model.
Okay. We'll get to you, I promise. One of the main aspects of Ed and Brandy's story was that in York County, we have sort of a wide spread between the percentage of temporary PFAs granted by judges on the bench. We could talk a little bit about, how are judges interpreting the law, and what kinds of things are they taking into account in the process and procedure. But I'm interested in possibly one of the judges in the audience, or maybe I see Victoria Connor, who is with the York County Bar Association. Maybe they want to jump in on this, but what kind of training is there in terms of directives for judges? Like, here's the law, here's how you enforce it, here's how you rule on these cases. Is it basically based on an individual's judge's perspective on the situation, or are there more stringent guidelines that they really should be following? And is there a role for the court, or maybe the AOPC, the administrative arm of the Pennsylvania courts, to sort of look at these things, look at the statistics, and say, there's an interesting spread here, what's going on? So do you folks, first of all, have any perspective on that? Do you think that there needs to be training, or is there some aspect of the law that...
Well, I think it's an interesting question, because we're not attorneys, and so we don't interpret the law. And that is a heavy burden, I think, for judges and attorneys to shoulder. And so I don't necessarily know the answer about how things are interpreted and all of that stuff, because that is beyond my level. I do think that judges absolutely take their responsibility seriously. And my finding is that when, and I've said this a couple of times, so some of you may have heard me say this before, but when we look at a situation in the context of power and control, when we look at a situation in the context of what we know about lethality, that absolutely gives us more information. So would it be a bad thing for folks to take those things into consideration while they interpret the law? And that may not be something that I can answer because that's not my role.
I guess what I would say is I think with the data that's out there now, it begs questions. I think Brandy and Ed's article left every reader, regardless of their level of expertise in this area, with questions. I do think those questions should be answered, but again, I'm not in a place to provide those answers. I imagine the courts will look at that and say, okay, let's understand this for what this is and make sense out of this. And that is my hope, that such an article that has data is kind of entitled to a response as to how do we reconcile this disparity here and what's going on. It's similar, we're accountable to the county as well too. And if there was a discrepancy in our data, I would feel compelled to be able to respond to that. But I do believe the court is looking at that. I don't know for sure, and certainly Judge Adams can respond on that, but I do think there should be some scrutiny as to, okay, why is this? Let's make sense. And maybe the answer is it's this reason and that reason's okay. But I think the article that Brandy and Ed wrote really left that prevailing question is, wait, why is your county different? And why are different judges different? So my hope is that over time we will be able to, have some answers to that, and we will be able to look at this process. And I look at this article really as an opportunity. I hope it's not a blaming as much as it is, okay, here is an issue here. How do we help to improve or look at the PFA process so that it is victim sensitive? That's my goal. So.
Well, I wanted to get this another person.
I just have a question as far as not just the judges that grant PFAs, but also temporary PFAs when you have to go. Are they looking at that as well? And also the clerks that work down that you have to go file your paperwork through? Like, I've had very bad experiences where in fact got hung up on when I was in the hospital from my abuser saying that you have to come downtown to get your PFA. You can't do it over the phone. And then also when DA's office was telling me you have to get a PFA because he's making recorded phone calls from jail saying he's going to get out and find you, and then called the magistrate, and he said, well, you know what a PFA is. It's just a piece of paper. I can punch you through a piece of paper. And that's my experience, because I couldn't get off of work because I was in the hospital for a week and didn't have any more time to go down and sit and wait to go to court for a temporary PFA. And like, it was just back and forth. But it was just those comments that were like, okay, like the nurse from the hospital was called down to see, and she even got a rude response to the point she called the police station back and was like, hey, you told her to do this and they're not doing it for her.
So I guess the question is.
So like, I understand, like, I've never had a problem with the judge once, the police or the judges, once I went down there, I got temporary, like I had sufficient evidence, it was granted like that, no problem. It was that temporary, that emergency PFA that it's like nobody, even the little people down that had to help me file paperwork, I got there 10 minutes before closing. Well, it takes more than 10 minutes. What do you expect us to do? We can't sit down and do this in 10 minutes. To the point I had to leave and go up to the DA's office. Like, I tried, I don't know what to tell you.
Okay. Any response to that?
The whole state's.
And that's just my, like, I don't think it's as big as the judges. Like, I've never had a problem with that. It's more that the other people that are involved, like the lower steps of getting to the judges.
Right.
We
And
understand.
I'm so sorry that that was your experience. And our hope is that that is absolutely changing. Ann and I have been working very closely with court administration, with Stacy Snyder, and with the Protection from Abuse Office staff to really work on making that experience better, okay? And from what I'm hearing, we're getting there. We're getting to where we need to be with that. It's an interesting setup because all counties don't have a protection from abuse office. All counties aren't set up exactly the same. And so with York County being one of the few counties that does have a PFA office, there have been some, well, how can we make this work? How does this work? And maybe not a whole lot of data from how other counties make it work because it is not the common streamlined process. One of the things that we have worked really hard on is, and it was mentioned in the article, is a cover sheet for the PFA packet that you go, when you go to the PFA office and you say, I need a PFA, and you're given this packet of paperwork, which can be very intimidating and scary, and you're clearly not having the best day of your life anyway, and so what do I even do with this paperwork, okay? Now the first thing that people look at when they see that is, you don't have to do this alone, okay? We'll help you with all of these things. And that's for Safe Home, for Access. We have an office that's right next to the PFA office at the courthouse that we share responsibility for staffing that office so that someone is absolutely there to help someone through that process.
When was that implemented?
That, we've had that office for a while. Back,
I mean, offering help, like when you go in.
That
when
was
did that
about
begin?
maybe a year and a half ago.
I don't think that that's the practice that they follow every day.
In my experience, the problem being, I work Monday through Friday. I took a week in the hospital to take time, which I'm trying to support me and my kids by myself.
correct,
Yeah.
I'm already financially
correct.
in a hardship, and I use my last half hour to go down to the courthouse, because I work for York County too.
Right.
And I used my last half hour, and I already put the paperwork off the line, filled it all out by myself, take it there. Oh, well, we'll see what we can do. And I said, well, I have it filled out. Oh, well, if you have no more time at work, you might as well not even get a PFA. That's exactly what I was told from them in the office. You need to have time to go to the court. You're supposed to be there 2 hours.
Isn't the only one like it.
Right.
In fact, that's a
Yeah.
majority of women's,
And they told
and
me.
I can only speak for women too, I'm
Yeah,
sorry,
and
but-
they told me about Safe House, and in fact, I called, and I think I even met with you, because I did get more time off work. Thank God I have understanding boss. And the thing was, when I went there, it was just to fill out paperwork. So yeah, I took another hour off to fill out
Right.
paperwork that, and in fact, originally I was told, oh, well, we're only gonna be here until 3:32.
Right, right.
Okay, and then when I broke down the phone, that's like, okay, well, we'll wait till 4 and maybe you can get in here. And then it was
Right.
still the same scenario. I still had to take off work to get to the courthouse.
Right, and let me comment on that. First of all, that's a great example of trauma, why systems need to be trauma-informed, okay? I don't know who responded to you, but it doesn't sound like your experience, you were responded to with somebody that really understood trauma, okay? The piece that we are advocating for, and that's what this sheet of paper is if someone arrives at that office, go right to an advocate. Go right to an advocate who is victim sensitive, because we have heard of concerns. This isn't the first time that we've heard that, so we actively have been working, as Heather and Ann mentioned, with the court administration to look at this problem. We have had and we have heard for years of people having these problems, so we're not going to discount that at all. As a matter of fact, it makes my heart race to hear that you have had that experience and that you have had this experience. We want to change that. The court has shown a willingness to make this more victim-centric and get people to advocates sooner than later. But if that's still continuing, again, that's another question that I think needs to be answered. And again, I'm sorry that you both had that experience. It
Just
never should
means
be
we
that
need to
way.
work harder.
And many
Yeah,
others
yeah, yeah, yes, they
that
are.
I know, maybe she knows as well,
So
but
ideally, when you go to the PFA office, you would be referred to somebody from Victim Services who is trauma-informed. And would help you with the petition for the protection order.
It's not offered. I mean, maybe you have received the paperwork
Mhm.
when the police arrive or whatever your situation is. Myself, other people I know, when they walked in that door, the person that escorted them back to do the paperwork never offered an advocate's help. She, in fact, well, the person that I dealt with, in fact, pointed out several things as to why I shouldn't follow through with filling out the PSA, causing me to leave. And thankfully, I'm one of the people who came back.
Well, and then they're in violation of law. They have to offer you an advocate. So I don't know what that situation is like.
This was in August, and I went up to the DA, because I had a victim assistant coordinator, because I was in trial, but like dealing with the
Right.
case. And they're the ones that actually said, call this number, make sure you get an emergency PFA for this weekend, and on Monday, call Access. And at that point, I had already dealt with all these people, and then I called to get the emergency PFA, and it doesn't get granted because he was eating dinner and needed an hour for me to meet him in Hanover. And then even when I was gonna get there, he wasn't sure if he could give it to me. And then on Monday I called, and then it was like that final, but like I've never had an issue with Access once I got in the door.
Right.
It just seems like if you're not working and on welfare, you can't get a PFA. You just can't, because I don't have the time at work. I can't sit
city
there.
access to the actual offices you need.
You can't, it's during working hours.
Right.
And it's so hard.
I was going to say, are we familiar with any communities nationwide in which this type of process could be done 24/7, separate from the courthouse, separate from the the bureaucracy of a government office like that? Could that be done at Access? Is it done at police stations?
Well, there are a couple of processes. There's the emergency order, which is when you call the district magistrate, which it sounds like that's what
you did.
You did.
Right.
Right, you call 911, you ask for the magistrate on duty, and that magistrate could order an emergency order of protection that is good until 4:30 the next business day. So that order, it expires fairly quickly. It gives you a window of protection for a weekend, for a night, and it gives you time to come in and file for what's known as the temporary order. To my knowledge, there's no mechanism, I'm not familiar with other states or other communities that might do a temporary order outside of business hours. I'm not aware of that. Separate from the emergency order, correct. And it is difficult. It is difficult because in order to get an order of protection, you must go before a judge. And they're there during business hours. We have, tried to work on the situation that you talked about coming in 10 minutes before.
Could it be done by a night magistrate? Do magistrates
Well,
handle this?
the emergency orders
Not
are,
the temporary?
Not the
yeah.
but not the
temporary.
temporary orders,
But
correct.
What do you think about that as a potential solution? Would there be merit to that? Making 24/7 availability for gaining that type of help as there is for arraigning somebody on criminal charges?
Mhm.
I don't know what the law is behind that. There may be a legal reason why a temporary for up to 10 business days can't be completed by a district magistrate after hours. I mean, there is 24 by design. Again, this gets back into processes versus, the law. We have a 24/7 approach to this. It doesn't sound like it's working as well in terms of the processes. We are always available 24/7 for victims, both programs. But I don't know if that there is a ability to change the emergency petition to a temporary petition. Probably not.
So I think we can agree that involving advocates in this process and the cover sheet telling people that they can have advocates was a step forward, okay?
Mhm.
Right.
Are there any
But-
common sense step forwards that do you think that need to be put in place that would help the process in the system?
Well, one thing I would say, and it seems like the obvious, get the word out if people are in these situations to call us. We are not just a shelter. I think one of the misnomers in the community that we're always battling is, I don't need to call Access Your because I don't need shelter. There are many different options available to victims, so I would constantly say, if you're a victim, make that first call to us, and then we can help you through whatever options are appropriate for you, whether they're PFA, whether it's relocation, whatever it may be. So for me, the obvious message, if everybody can take this out of this room today, is if you're a victim of domestic violence, call us. We are available 24/7.
And just to add on to that, in addition to the misnomer that you have to go into shelter to get services, I think some victims think that that we're going to make them do something they're not ready to do, like make them get a protection order, make them leave the relationship, make them go to the police. And that is not the case. We are there to give them options, and let them drive their own situation. So I think, and when the police say, how can we get people to come in to avail themselves of services, I always say, tell them we are not going to make them do something they're not ready for. I think that's just important.
Just really quickly, and then we'll take it, I promise that we'll take it to the audience. One of the things that we hear from judges is that, granting a temporary PFA is a big deal because it affects the defendant, okay? So the defendant has to get out of his house, her house, or loses access to guns, tools, clothes, finances, and so forth. Do you have any ideas that might improve the system that would sort of make judges not so concerned that they're going to unfairly impact somebody who hasn't had a hearing yet, who's not had a chance to stay in court yet? Getting the person tools. Is there an official thing or some sort of process that could be put in place that could address those issues so judges might be more inclined to grant temporary PFAs?
Well, I think when you look at that, you also need to look at not just the defendant being a victim, because that doesn't happen in all cases for a PFA. A lot of times the victim leaves the residence and then her property is in jeopardy. So we need to look at both sides. And I think that is something that we are, there was up until 2003, there were constables that were supervising retrieval of belongings. And then that stopped because their solicitor told them that they would be liable and that they would be, I guess the term would be civil refereeing. So we are actually we're going to be meeting with the constable next week and examining that. The other thing I can tell you is that we have, Heather and I are co-chairs of the York County Domestic Violence Fatality Review Team. And one of the recommendations that came out of one of those reviews is to help the defendant, because that person is in crisis as well. When they get served with a protection order, that we have designed a brochure to be served with the protection order by the sheriffs that speaks to shelters and legal information, what is important for them not to do, what they can do, legal services, all of those things that will keep them out of crisis, because keeping them out of crisis speaks to victim safety as well.
He had asked about other communities where the process is a 24/7 process, and I can't speak for every single community, but I did for a while volunteer with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. The majority of abductions or family abduction during the time of divorce, separation, that kind of thing, common in domestic violence. And in dealing with people across the country, I never saw a system that was different, that it offered that 24/7. But what you do see, and going back to mandating this training, is there's no continuity in people's ability throughout the process to deal with victims, domestic violence victims, which we encountered a lot. And, talking about making this elective for people that are interested. However, you don't get to decide if you're going to address that call, if you're going to address that issue. So to me, saying I'm not interested in that training is not an option. That's part of your job. Mm-hmm. And that's what I would see a lot, is you would come upon these cases, well, the officer that responded didn't know. A lot of officers don't know that there is no 24-hour waiting period to report a missing person. That's a federal law. Mm-hmm. But they simply don't know it because they've not had training in dealing with these instances. So for me personally, I don't understand how you could advocate
I think our approach to that was, needless to say, we're a little biased. The three of us are very victim-centric, and on a daily basis, we're enraged at how systems let down victims. Okay, full disclosure. And we won't ever be different than that. What I try to do is balance out all the stakeholders involved in a situation, and in this particular case, I was looking at what Maryland was saying was working best for them, but again, we're not Maryland, so maybe there is a need for a different discussion. So I feel like you're right. Maybe we're at a place where, okay, maybe it wasn't enough. And actually our statewide coalition on domestic violence, that was their position too, is that make this voluntary. So we may be at a different place, and I will certainly take this to PCADV and say, okay, I think we need to put this back on the table for discussion, because I think a lot of times, and I think the same way about defendants and their rights. I really want to understand all the different dimensions here, but in full disclosure, I'm biased, because in 25 years, I've seen the people that come before us and need these things, and like Heather mentioned earlier, it is not done casually, it is done painfully. They are in extreme pain, and they feel naked to the world, they feel powerless, they feel shame, they feel so many things. So for us to be biased, that's where we're coming from. We get to know these victims. But I agree with you. I do think it's important, and maybe it's a time to look at, hey, what should Pennsylvania do with this? Because you're right, we don't get to pick and choose our laws.
Back here in the background.
And I'm going to bring up an issue that probably nobody wants to hear. And at 75, I feel like it's long enough to say this. Your county is traditionally a very conservative county, rather German. Most of the judges are male. You very likely, and I have gone through this with a recent civil hearing that I had, where the judge completely ignored the fact that I had pertinent information and found at least half in favor of the fellow who, and in fact, your president judge has that information. I had to give it through a policeman to get to him, and I've never heard anything except that I need to go to the state, which I did, and filed a complaint. But in any event, the system, to a degree, as in many cases, is rigged against females. And I know nobody wants to hear that, but you've got to face the fact that you've got a majority of male judges who are looking at a woman who may or may not be able to represent herself fully. You have police officers coming from 72 municipalities with police from a variety of places who are growing up in this area perhaps, who also view women in a particular way. Your system, and I've gone to the commissioners with this and spoken on Wednesdays, I have no hesitancy, this system does not work for the person who is either finding against a defendant, because you're basically told, get a lawyer, get a lawyer, get a lawyer. We can't tell you anything because we can't give you any kind of legal advice. So no matter what it is, the only thing they'll do is hand you a file and say, here, get a lawyer. In this case, you are dealing with the judiciary that may be very sexist, and I'm sorry for the folks who are here to hear that, but I've lived a long time. I've been very involved with women's groups over time. In fact, Access York is there because our organization now got its going in the beginning when Women's Action York. So that's a long time back, 40 plus years.
Any response to that? Do you think the sexist issues?
Nobody's going to want to say it.
The statistics in your paper show that the women judges were granting the fewest. That Judge Marcisa Strong was granting the fewest, that Judge Platts was granting the most.
Any other comments?
Yeah, it goes back to my question about mandating versus voluntary. Look, the abuse of power and control. Who's in charge? And believe me, I am a strong advocate of the courts and the police. Power and control, the police. Police departments, police families have higher incidents of domestic violence 2 to 4 times than the normal public. There's so much variation between county and county, judge to judge. It's like we're afraid to step on someone's toes. And I can hear it in the responses with the judges being here. We need buy-in. People are losing their darn lives.
Yes, they are. They are.
And, you know, you have to swallow pride at one point and say, good gracious, I'm here because I have to follow the laws. And I'm not putting myself in anybody's position. I wouldn't want the job. But to hear some of these stories, it's unbelievable.
It's heartbreaking, isn't it?
It's awful.
It's heartbreaking.
And I'm not saying there's any good answer, but I'll think back to maybe the Boy Scouts, where there was some abuse going on, and now you're required to have 2 people with them at all times. That was done, the reason they got that done was through a lawsuit.
Right.
And pressure.
Right.
Unrelenting pressure.
Right.
Against the establishment.
Yes. And there's a couple comments, if I can comment. Family violence is so insidious and so prevalent that we almost, it's the infamous, the last thing a fish would ever notice is the water. It has become so commonplace for us that we bury our heads in the sand and say, that's family business. What happens with them? So I think that's a part of it. Back to your point, I will respond. York County is sexist and York County is racist. It has been our experience and we have seen that. We know that York County has historically struggled with those things, but we can't disregard those aspects. And yes, I'll say that as the man from the YWCA, but I am proud to say that as an advocate because I witness it from a point of white male privilege every day where I see outside of me that some of the experts that I know and the people that I know don't get the same invitations and respect that I get because I'm a white male guy with a tie. I'm sorry that's true, but I just wanted to validate your point because it is a larger community issue. I think we have to look at the processes and we have to turn up the heat, like you said. This is about saving lives. The prevalence is so high, 15 domestic violence related fatalities. We almost beat Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. Is that who we want to be?
Philadelphia.
We did beat Philadelphia. Is that who York County wants to be? I think we should rally to do everything in our power to say to victims in this community, we're going to have our act together as the systems. We're going to empower you, we're going to respect you because we understand this is an epidemic.
Okay, we have time for one more comment or question. We wanted to end at 1 o'clock, but so go ahead.
I think also it's not just about discriminating against women. I and some others, I think I'm not poor, I'm not of color, and I feel discriminated against in this situation. It's important to recognize the people who are in a situation that it's not old hat. It's their first time ever experiencing it.
Right,
And
right.
they are hardworking people, and when you go in there, as a person who's never experienced that in your family, and you're not used to that type of life, you're not used to, that type of person shouldn't be looked at and said, well, you have a good job. And the person who abused you had a good job, let's not do something to mess that up.
Right.
But the people who come in there who are, this is their, 10th time, they know how it goes, they know what, it just seems like it was a different experience for myself, for other people that I know that are in my circumstance, whereas though and it was the process prior to actually sitting in front of the judge, just so I can clarify, but, and also with police officers, I personally had a great experience with my police officers. They were state troopers, so maybe their training was a little bit better, and I think that whatever tools they were given were good. And they were younger, too. And if that speaks for anything on the process, then
Right.
thumbs up. But it's not just people of color.
And
it's not just people who are in poverty.
Yeah.
It's it's the working people who are struggling every day and who, when they're affected by it, that's when you really see, and this person behind me also spoke on it too, that's when you see a really wall in front of you with trying to
Right.
get something done.
Right. Yeah, we see that across the board. It's called victim blaming. You know, once you get put in the box of a victim, we have to look. Again, the commitment needs to be that we all take this very seriously. We want York County to be better. We want to be there for all residents, like you point out. And then we have to have the commitment, the discussions, the training, and the tightening up of processes. Why? Because people deserve that.
Regardless of where they come
That's
from.
right.
Regardless of
Yeah.
whether this is
Right.
their first time in an abusive relationship or if it is their 10th time. Because our goal is to help you make it the last time, regardless, for you to be safe.
I want to thank our panelists for coming and talking with us today. Thank you, Rick, Heather, Ann. Thank you very much. I'm
Thank
sure
you.
you'll be happy to hang around for a little while.
Sure.
Sure.
Can
I
I
have
put,
a perception that I am trying to monopolize this, but I am a lawyer with 40 years of experience in representing abused women and men. I have helped to set up access. I was the president of the board. I have also spent years and years getting disability benefits for those people who have been so abused that they can no longer function. First of all, why is this woman who was in the hospital for a week having to get a PFA? Why isn't that man in jail on charges of aggravated assault? Why should she have to get a PFA to protect herself from a violent crime? Why wasn't he arrested? Secondly, the PFA law says that it doesn't have to be a recent incident. It can be a course of conduct that causes that woman to be afraid. The judges who are not granting as much, I don't think are thinking about the course of conduct. They're not thinking about what you're saying is that they have to reach a certain point in their psyche. They have to reach a situation where they can safely leave. They've arranged to take the kids and the dog and everything. And the judges are, well, you didn't get hit yesterday. Well, they need to be trained in victim
Right,
mentality.
you're right.
I was